Frances and I met when I was doing my master's degree at the University of Virginia, and she was in a PhD program, and we sort of overlapped in some of the classes and so forth. And I've been kind of like keeping my eye on Frances's work ever since, because she's involved in Buddhism and medicine as well as me, so has been something of a pioneer in that field. But in any case, the work of hers that I've been most avidly following in the last maybe like 5 years or so is she's the person who introduced me to the idea of trauma-aware pedagogy. Reading her stuff introduced me to the idea of contemplative pedagogy, and I just think the work that she's done at the University of Toronto in that area has been just really inspirational. And so she was actually the first person I thought about bringing to our campus to participate in this series.
Yeah, thank you all so much for inviting me. I'm excited to talk with you about some of the experiences I've had over the last few years, integrating flourishing or well-being into my classroom, but then also to hear about your experiences too. Yeah, so just to situate me where I'm coming from as I speak today, I teach at the University of Toronto, as Pierce said, in a large department of religious studies, and I teach undergraduate and graduate courses. Mostly in Buddhist studies, and my research background, as Pierce said, is religion, medicine, or religion, health, healing. I've done the work that I'm going to describe today in courses, in small courses up to larger ones of up to 170 or so students. And I'll note too that I've only taught asynchronously since early 2020. And so, although later I'm happy to talk about in-person teaching too, if you want to, and I have a few really super books I could share and recommend on exercises for the in-person classroom. So my initial question when I got into this kind of work was, can we make, or how can we make self-care or honoring one's own and others' physical, emotional, relational, or professional needs part of our study and work in the classroom? So in other words, how can an integrated understanding of the whole student and the professor be part of what goes on in the classroom from the moment of course design, but then also be an active force driving what happens in throughout the course of the semester, either in the in-person classroom or in an online experience? So I got into this first, as Pierce described, by studying trauma-aware pedagogies. And I did a lot of reading and took some short courses. And I just did a ton of learning on trauma and stress and their impact on learning, especially in the context of higher education. So there are a ton of resources on this topic, as I'm sure you've heard. And as I learned about that, I tried to think about how to design my courses around the principles of trauma-aware pedagogy, which I've listed here. So I know you've discussed this in some detail in some of the other presentations in this series, so I won't go into great detail about this, but just to start out by saying that I started to think about creating in the classroom an environment of safety, trustworthiness, connection, collaboration, empowerment, to focus on social justice in some way, and to think about students' resilience and opportunities for growth and change. So I started to use these, as you'll see, as my design principles for thinking about how to come up with a new course, design a new course, or to transform an existing course. And as you'll see, I would sort of even like check off each component of my course against these principles. So I was really especially motivated by understanding how trauma creates barriers for learning. So it's more than a mental health issue or a physical health issue. And I know that a lot of professors will think that we're not qualified to consider students' mental health or physical health. But really, I came to understand how it's an educational issue. And so it is a critical issue for us as teachers, and something that's within our capacity and within our ability to do something about. And it's also, very importantly, about accessibility and justice in the classroom. So a few years ago, I started in this way to completely redesign all of my courses. So I'll describe some of the ways that I've done this today. So before I get into more details about some other issues, a few procedural basics that I've implemented include these here: providing radical flexibility and deadlines and options for assignments, otherwise known as replacing coercion and punishment with options and logical consequences, trusting students, not requiring accessibility evidence, and attending to my own well-being as a sort of foundational basis for my teaching practice. Secondly, I started paying really close attention to representation in course content, thinking about who is represented and how, and making sure that I was doing my best to reflect students' identities, cultures, and life circumstances. I started separating feedback from assessment by practicing radical ungrading. And then I redesigned coursework. I don't use the word assignment and assessment really anymore. I call it all work. So I redesigned all of the coursework to engage skills for flourishing. So these three items are the ones I'll go into some more detail about here. So the first, I really started to think about the course community as constituting not only me, the instructor, and the students and the teaching assistants, but also the authors, or in my case, maybe authors, artists, and activists who I was choosing to present as experts in the class. So the people, this means the people whose videos we watched, whose podcasts we listened to, or whose books and articles we read, this all together with the students and the instructors, this is the course community. And so you can see they're listed there on the course webpage as on the same level or part of our community overall. And so this is maybe a small thing, but I made a point of featuring these members of the course community on a page on the course website so that students could see and listen to, see and learn about the people who were serving as authorities or participants, I would say, in the course. So this was also a means for me to check and confirm that I wasn't relying on the same old group of white male experts that are typically held up as the experts in my discipline. Doing this really enabled me to transform the nature of the course in all kinds of really important ways. Okay, so next I started practicing radical ungrading, which involves separating feedback from assessment. So a few years ago, I was really inspired by this book by Susan Bloom on ungrading, and I totally recommend it. It's an edited volume that covers how you might implement the very many ways that you can do what's called ingrading in different disciplines, different kinds of courses, not only in the humanities, but also in the sciences and the social sciences. And so it goes into the history of grading, presenting a lot of research about how grades are especially harmful for marginalized populations, and how standardized approaches to assessment and grades are inequitable, essentially. This research makes it also really so clear about how ungrading methods are not a lowering of standards, contrary to what many people think, but rather they're about giving more feedback to students and raising students' critical investment in their learning, helping them learn how to do self-evaluations and how to set really high standards for themselves. This research really showed me how grades are about ranking students, not evaluating their work or giving them feedback. And so I started to really get how, since students are all starting at different places when they come into a classroom, it doesn't make that much sense to expect them to get to the same place in the end. And now that I've done this for a number of years, I really get how not everyone needs to do the same amount of work to reach a valuable amount of learning for them. So I've also learned about how grades don't make space for encouraging the kinds of epiphanies or wonder or curiosity that were the most valuable things for me in student work. And in fact, to the contrary, grades typically discourage those kinds of experiences. I was also inspired along these lines by Jay Dolmage's work here, pictured here, Academic Ableism, Disability in Higher Education. I really strongly recommend this for all of us. It's also an accessibility and equity issue to do the kind of ungrading and the other kinds of course design transformations that I've been trying to do in my classes. If you're new to this approach, I would also recommend the work of Jesse Stommel, whose website, jessestommel.com, has a lot of really helpful information and tips on how to ungrade. His many presentations and resources there help us think about why we think we want to grade or we need to grade, what we think grading accomplishes, what grades mean, and how feedback functions in relation to grades, and what would happen then if we didn't grade. So this is the kind of research that I did before I jumped into that scary abyss of eliminating my control over grading. and it was very helpful to learn about these. So what I've done is try to tie the practice of ungrading into other writing and thinking work in the classroom, using what some people call micro-phenomenological reflection. Sometimes we just call that reflection papers. But this is a kind of, how I'm presenting this to students is that it's a kind of deeply active philosophical thinking, where students are really deeply considering their own life experiences, their subjective experiences in the context of the wider social, historical, educational, and cultural circumstances that might come up in the context of a course. And so this means in this kind of work, the students' individual voices and life experiences are themselves like the super important and valid important data for the discussion in the class, or for what's happening in the class. And so this is the kind of assignment that I'll do throughout the semester. And then this also leads to the type of ungrading that I do, which is a series of self-assessments. So each of the assignments that the students do, they grade themselves through these kinds of meta-reflections, which are like detailed surveys or questionnaires or reflection papers, where they reflect on their learning in a course or for even for a given piece of work. And so I might ask them questions like some of these, like this might be at the end of a semester. I might say, please let me know if you've completed the basic requirements for this assignment, and if you didn't, please explain why. Discuss how your written reflections express a continuing engagement with the course materials as the semester progressed. How do you see your thinking about the course develop over time? Or, for example, I ask them, please to zoom out and give thought to the overall experience of engaging with the course content as a whole. So the design of the course, and to think about what this altogether, what impact this had on their learning or on their life maybe, or on their interest in the topic for this course. So these are not like easy questions to answer. They really have to give this a lot of thought. And then this kind of questionnaire will be done for each piece of work, each major piece of work in the course. And then, of course, I have to submit letter grades. And those students will say, after doing these kind of long series of meta reflections, I think, therefore, that my grade is an A, or my grade is a C, because I couldn't do this or that were my goals for myself. And I'll say, just since people often ask me about this, I've gotten about the same distribution of grades that I would have gotten, that I used to get before when I did traditional grading. So students, I think, are really being quite honest with themselves as they give themselves grades. But beyond that, I would say that the experience of the course as ungraded is like totally transformative, is profoundly a different learning experience than a typically graded course, both for the students and for me. And so I can see like really clearly how student learning is just like deeply liberated. And the class feels like fun and enthusiastic and empowering. And students often also make note specifically of how proud they feel of the work, they feel about the work they do in these classes. And that's kind of amazing. Okay, so the third category of things that I'm going to talk about is how I kind of totally redesigned the work in the class, in my classes. So I started to redesign my courses so that I could really prioritize skills, different kinds of skills for student flourishing or well-being. The skills I'll talk about now are specifically some embodied activities that I've integrated into my courses. And I would say, actually, that's the wrong way to put it. It's not that I integrated them into my courses. It's rather that I chose these embodied activities and I designed courses around them. And that's what I want to share with you. So these are different kinds of movement, breathing practices, listening practices, art making, or a collection of kind of self-care, community care work that I'll describe at the end. So this came out of thinking and doing some research about learning as embodiment. So teaching and learning as movement specifically. So I don't mean like it's not about teaching about movement or teaching through movement, but really teaching as movement or embodiment, and having students reflect on what kinds of learning occurs in the body or through embodied action or as embodied action. What is that learning that happens in our bodies? So I was really inspired by this book pictured here, Minding Bodies, which goes into a lot of detail on the science, like the research on the importance of physical movement and awareness, embodied awareness, and attention to sensory input, and also our spatial environments, to the importance of those kinds of things to learning. So then, kind of thinking about this for a long time and reading this book and other resources, I looked in my case, in my field, for examples of assignments or kinds of coursework that we could do, that I could do, that would involve embodied action. So I'll give you some examples of those. One is, I recently taught an Introduction to Buddhism course. So I've taught Introduction to Buddhism many times for decades, 2 decades, and in many different ways. In this case, I was trying to think about learning as embodiment and how we can learn about Buddhism through embodiment or as embodied beings. And so I had these 3 options in an embodied practice module that was weighted as half the coursework. So the other half of the coursework was reading and doing some meta-reflective writing, philosophical writing in the way I described before. But then half of the coursework was this, what I called moving minds, disembodied practice, where they had to choose 2 of these and do 4-week practices, 4-week walking practice, recitation or dance. And then there are a bunch of other forms of work, other kinds of assignments scaffolded around these embodied experiences that they were having. So that's one way that I've done that. Another way I've integrated embodied movement or embodied practice into my courses is the way that I've delivered course lectures as these immersive sound and movement experiences. So here I record audio lectures and I ask students to walk outside while they listen to these lectures, ideally walking in a natural setting somewhere, maybe in a park or in a forest or ravine, like somewhere nearby them. Or if they can't go outside, as many people can't, or that maybe walking is not comfortable for them, they could also lie down, close their eyes, and imagine being in a place like that. So here I'm trying just very simply to encourage students to get away from the chair and the computer and to learn a skill for well-being, which is simply to go for a walk. So this is just a simple example of how I'm redesigning course delivery to encourage a healthy physical activity, or certainly at least to enable getting away from the chair and the screen. We're often trained, we're really trained from childhood that the seated posture is the posture in which we're supposed to think. And good thinking happens when we're seated. So in my classes, I've been trying to get students to recognize how thinking or how learning occurs in movement. So what I'm kind of just trying to describe here is rethinking the type of content that I teach. So it's the same old courses in some cases, like Introduction to Buddhism, but how can I redesign that course so that walking is relevant? For example, it's not so hard for me teaching Buddhism because we can focus on pilgrimage or walking meditation or migration or something. And these are topics that would naturally be part of a Buddhist studies course or the study of Buddhism. And so I emphasize those, or ritual, movement, dance, and then allow students to see in their bodies, how does it feel to move and think and be in those forms, those embodied forms. So I start with that kind of embodied experience that I want to emphasize, and then I build the course around that. Another example where I've done that is a course called Biohacking Breath, which is on Asian religious, philosophical, and medical traditions of breath or wind. And in this case, I ask students to do these 2 5-week modules, practice modules, where they learn certain breathing techniques, and they had to do them at home 5 days a week, 15 minutes a day, maintain a record of their work in a log, integrate that experience into reflective assignments, written assignments, and so forth. So there's a series of scaffolded sort of inquiries that go along with this embodied practice. And so this is another example of how I actually proposed a new course where I started with research on how simple breathing techniques have a big impact on our well-being through the regulation of the nervous system. And so I thought first of that experiential embodied practice that I wanted students to learn about. And then I designed the whole course around that. I'll give you a few examples of students' reactions to these kinds of courses. So this student says, my health condition is mostly triggered by stress, but these exercises have really helped me. Prior to this, I would simply get stressed out and not know what to do. So, many of us are still in this experience now, but remember being a 20-year-old, they don't know what to do when they're super stressed out. So the students, many of them found that just doing this 4-7-8 breathing practice helped them a lot in just calming down. So then on the right here are the principles of trauma-aware teaching, where I would try to kind of see how did I succeed in bringing forth some of those principles in what the students did and what they said they experienced. Another student said, I suffered from anxiety for a few years, and thanks to this course, I was able to find myself feeling calmer, helped me get better sleep, and I felt more productive. This is a third student who said, because I teach asynchronously, I have a lot of students who are doing the courses with their mothers, especially. And so a lot of family connections being built. So this student said she did this whole course with her mother, and she said she almost started crying while working on the final project because of how differently she feels about things and how much her perspective has shifted. Excuse me. So here's another example. This is an assignment that I did called Speaking Out and Listening In. This was part of a course on histories of meditation and race in North America. And so the assignment was to conduct and discuss the experiences of 4 conversations that they had with people. In 2 cases, they were to be the listener, and in 2 cases, they were to practice being listened to by the other person. And so this is a practice based on sometimes called bearing witness, or a listening circle, or embodied listening, or mindful listening, or deep listening. And so there's a lot of research on all of these types of practices that are done in Buddhist traditions and other traditions as well. So students read about that, and then they had the chance to practice that and reflect on the experience. So here I was kind of aiming for a sense of community and support through this experience, but also to think about the process of listening being part of learning. So often in our courses, we teach people how to develop their point of view and present their own ideas through writing or oral presentation. But we rarely think about the practice of listening as a critical part of learning. And so that was the emphasis in this assignment. Students had a lot of positive responses to this project, and a student in the class and I co-authored an article on the experience of this assignment. So for example, one student said, this assignment really made me reevaluate my life, really opened my mind. So that's like a kind of a radical reaction to a class, or even to an assignment in a class. Another component of the Speaking Out and Listening In assignment in that same class was this art project, the post-secret art project, where students were to create an artwork that shares a secret from their lives. And of course, they share it anonymously. So this was posted on a class website that you can see at speaklisten.live or live. And I was going to make a mural, but the department closed down. It was during the pandemic. And so it wasn't a physical mural. It was this online gallery. And then students were meant, after all the artworks were submitted, students were to look at the artworks and reflect on what they saw in their community. And so this, I'd never done anything like this or seen anything like this done. So I didn't know what kind of reaction I was going to get, but the student comments were just like amazing. So one student said, for example, when looking at the gallery, I felt like I could relate to many of the secrets the other students shared. Having this gallery allows us to feel a connection to each other around common ground. Another student said, I think the artwork that the class produced is so beautiful and so meaningful. I think looking at all these posts make me feel like I'm part of a collective and part of a whole and not isolated. I saw my own secrets in postcards that were not mine. So yeah, I guess so. I have lots of examples of assignments like this, but and hundreds of student comments along these same lines. But what I've tried to emphasize here is how I chose examples of assignments that are meant to be, of course, educational and related to the course content, but also to be specifically nourishing or healing in some way, and to link to these principles of trauma-aware teaching. So the final type of assignment or coursework that I've been doing over the couple of years is that I'll describe is a self-care, so-called self-care assignment. And so I've done this in a few different ways, and I'll tell you how I started and then how I'm thinking of it more now after a few years. So I started with this self-care starter kit that was created by the University of Buffalo School of Social Work. And this was an assignment, a semester-long assignment for the students that was worth 15% of their final grade. So it's not an insignificant part of their overall work for the course. So it involves a series of resources and steps that I ask students to undergo throughout the course of the semester. Of course, it was self-assessed at the end or along the way also. And it specifically asked students to identify different aspects of their life that they thought were going really well and other aspects they wanted to work on, to think of some strategies and goals that they might want to develop over the semester. And then also some strategies that they wanted to kind of have in their pocket in case there was an emergency or some sort of crisis during the semester, which there was for many students. And then I would check in with them periodically throughout the semester using a form online, where asking them not to disclose any personal information for sure, but just to tell me how they were doing and whether they wanted to make any changes to their plans. So I'll give you just a few comments on this. So here again, this student said the program really restructured their worldview. The second student said, building on what I've learned about the importance of cultivating my health and breath, as well as the interoceptive awareness I started seriously developing this term. With the self-care project, I've been proactively practicing, listening to and honoring the needs of my body, mind, spirit, emotions, relationships, professional being, and so on. Another student said, since creating this plan, I've learned that during my experience of certain kinds of triggers, I require certain self-care interventions, and that some help more than others. So I've been thinking I should create a version of my self-care plan, of my emergency self-care plan organized by situation or intensity of emotion. I've also been considering the usefulness of decision charts for reorganizing my emergency self-care plan. So, I mean, it's just, to me, it seems like astounding that young people would be thinking like this. So in such an organized and sort of intellectual way about kind of taking care of themselves during a busy and really difficult, almost, really difficult semester during the pandemic. Yeah, so after doing that University of Buffalo self-care project in a couple of courses, I really realized that I strongly disliked the word self-care, and I wanted to develop some resources that were kind of similar to the kind of useful structure that the Buffalo protocol gave to us, but that emphasized more like social factors and systemic issues relating to our own circumstances, and that allowed students to think more deeply about embeddedness and interconnection and community. And so I developed this project called Wind Vane, in which I interviewed faculty, staff, and students around the University of Toronto, and the interviews are all published on the website, to ask who work on different areas of well-being or health or flourishing. So as philosophers, scientists, psychologists, religious studies people, therapists, and so on, to give students some resources on well-being and also some ways to think about exploring well-being and understand suffering as just part of our collective experience and our daily lives. And so then my question became, how can our university experience as students become a time of flourishing instead of a time of misery and suffering, which is the case for so many of our students now? And so I connected with some other people working in this area around different universities. in particular, someone at the University of Virginia who came up with this list of pedagogies, of principles in pedagogy, in the pedagogy of flourishing. And so if we have a little bit of time, I'll just quickly summarize some of these because they're really beautiful. So she says, Dr. Kinane says, you might be interested in pedagogies of flourishing if you care about the well-being of your students more than you care about the content of your discipline. If you recognize the whole student, if you value process as much as product, if you aim to help students find their voices and build agency, if you value the self as a subject of inquiry in addition to course content, if you honor interdependence, if you challenge objective truth claims, consider the relationship between awareness and actions, if you encourage collaboration rather than competition, if you're comfortable with emergent outcomes, if you're using processes for intention setting and reflection to bookend experiences, if you're teaching students to apply concepts to their everyday lives, if you're recognizing the power of education to cultivate disposition, if you're encouraging students to learn their learning processes to transform society, and if you believe that education should be transformational. So when I connected with these other researchers who are doing what they call pedagogies of flourishing, I really found a lot of meaning and inspiration from these principles. And I'm now really thinking of these as guiding principles for my course design and teaching decisions. In the process then, finally, I came to this idea of healing-centered engagement, which is a kind of a critique of trauma-aware pedagogy, in which some scholars suggest that trauma-aware pedagogies kind of focus on deficits, or they focus on what's kind of going wrong in one's life, in a student's life, whereas healing-centered engagement relies on much of the same science and many of the same principles, but focuses on what's going right in students' lives. And so it involves creating paths to well-being that are restorative by being empowering, community-oriented, and culturally informed and responsive to place and history, and that are essentially salutogenic or restorative. So salutogenic, I had to look that word up when I first learned it, means these are approaches to well-being that focus on health rather than disease, and that focus on restoring healthy forms of individual, cultural, and community identity. So this is now, like you've just kind of heard the arc of my progression from trauma-aware pedagogies to what I'm now sort of really liking is this concept of healing-centered engagement, and thinking about how to use these principles, as well as these principles of flourishing, to shape my course design, online, asynchronous, and also in person whenever I get to doing that again. And so finally, to summarize, I've talked about paying extra attention to representation, radical ungrading, and then a few examples of how I've redesigned courses and coursework to center skills for flourishing. So thank you so much. I hope I haven't talked too much.
No, I want you to talk more and more and more. You could like talk for a week. But I want to like see your syllabus, and I want to like, you know, be a little fly on the wall in your classroom. And yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Francis. I'm so moved by whenever I hear you talk about this. I just really am so inspired by the work that you're doing, and really feel like what you're doing is a model for me. Maybe I can see that more clearly because I teach the same kinds of things that you do in health humanities and religious studies. But for me, I'm very interested in adopting a lot of these perspectives, and have been trying to, but you've given me even more to work with.